London, 1848. The city glittered beneath a veil of gaslight, its cobblestone streets alive with the rumble of carriages, the laughter of revellers, and the hushed whispers that threaded through every salon and ballroom. To outsiders, it was a season of elegance, of silk gowns and golden chandeliers, of champagne toasts and promises exchanged under the guise of waltzes. But for those who lived within it, society was a battlefield. Reputations were made and broken with a single whisper. And at the very heart of this dangerous game stood one man whose name carried both fascination and fear. The Duke of Ravensfield. Damien Ravensfield was not merely another titled lord, parading about in velvet coats and polished boots. He was a figure carved into legend by grief, betrayal, and a vow that had chilled his heart to ice. Years ago, he had been a man in love, a man who believed in the sanctity of marriage and the sweetness of trust. He had loved his late wife with a devotion that others had envied. And for that devotion, he had been rewarded with humiliation. For while he labored to uphold his family's name, she had sought warmth in the arms of another man, a friend of his, no less. The scandal had shattered him, but worse than that, her sudden death, before any reconciliation or explanation, had left him with wounds that never closed. From that day, Ravensfield had made his vow. Never again. Never would he allow a woman to touch his soul. Never would he place his heart in another's hands. He would play his part as duke, provide for his estate, guard his fortune, and uphold his family name. But love was buried with her. And so he lived year after year, a fortress in human form. At every ball, young women whispered behind their fans about his fortune, his power, his darkly handsome face with storm-grey eyes that seemed to pierce through the crowd. Mothers maneuvered their daughters into his path, hoping for a smile, a dance, a word that might hint at future prospects. But Ravensfield gave them nothing. His politeness was cold, his gloved hand never lingering more than a second on a dance partner's fingers, his words clipped and distant. In time, society began to speak of him not as a man but as a myth, the unapproachable duke, the one who had vowed never to love again. And it was true, his vow was iron, or at least it had been. The night that would change everything began at Lady Worthington's masquerade ball. Her townhouse blazed with 1,000 candles, the chandeliers dripping in crystal, the polished floor gleaming beneath the swirl of satin and lace. Music floated through the air as violins sang and laughter echoed off gilded walls. Beneath the masks, faces glowed with mischief, longing and ambition. But Damien Ravensfield, dressed in a black coat embroidered with silver thread, his mask severe and his bearing proud, entered not with excitement, but with weary detachment. Another night, another charade, he walked through, the crowd as though untouched by it, a dark figure in a sea of colour. Yet, amid the whirl of dancers and the flutter of fans, his eyes caught something unexpected. At the edge of the ballroom, half hidden from the chandelier's glow, stood a young woman who did not try to capture attention. She did not laugh loudly or angle herself toward the Duke's passing figure, as so many did. Instead, she stood with quiet composure, auburn curls catching the candlelight, emerald eyes observing the dancers with a calm that seemed almost defiant. Lady Arabella Whitmore. Once the darling of society, her beauty and wit had been celebrated, her presence eagerly sought after. But envy is a cruel companion, and scandal even crueler. A rumour, false, vicious, yet unstoppable, had marked her. A supposed impropriety, whispered behind closed doors, magnified until it ruined her. Former suitors withdrew, friends turned cold, invitations ceased. Now she was no more than an ornament at the edge of the ballroom, tolerated but unwelcome, watched more for her disgrace than for her charm. Ravensfield knew her name, of course. He knew everyone's. Yet when he passed near her, his attention fixed on the music. His sleeve brushed hers. It was nothing, a mere accident, his gloved arm grazing against her bare hand as the dancers spun past. But in that instant, something happened. A spark, a jolt that shot through him like a current, so sharp and unexpected that he halted just for a breath. It was absurd, impossible. He had not felt anything for years. His vow had been ironclad, his heart a grave sealed shut. Yet that fleeting touch burned through him, leaving his chest unsteady, his breath caught. Arabella's eyes lifted then, green locking with grey. For the briefest moment, the crowded ballroom fell away. There was no music, no laughter, no glitter of chandeliers. Only her gaze meeting his, steady, unflinching, filled with quiet strength. He should have looked away, he should have dismissed it as chance. But he did not. He lingered, caught in a silence that felt louder than the violins themselves. And in that silence, his vow, the vow that had kept him safe for so long, trembled. Arabella Whitmore, disgraced and forgotten, had unknowingly struck the first blow against the fortress he had built around his heart. And nothing, though he could not yet see it, would ever be the same. In the glittering world of London's high society, reputation was everything. A smile from the right person could open doors to influence and security, while a whisper in the wrong ear could topple a young woman's future as swiftly as a toppled goblet of wine. For Lady Arabella Whitmore, the daughter of a once respected baron, that lesson had come cruelly and without mercy. Just one season ago, Arabella had been at the height of her promise. With auburn curls that caught the light like fire and emerald eyes that seemed to see more than most, she had been hailed as the rose of the season. Invitations had flooded her family's modest townhouse. Young lords jostled for her attention. Mothers had measured her as a potential daughter-in-law. Arabella had been admired not merely for her beauty, but for her wit, her kindness to servants, and her unshaken sense of self. She was no simpering debutante who giggled behind her fan. She was graceful, but she was also strong. And perhaps that strength was what made her enemies. The scandal had begun in whispers, as all scandals do. A chance encounter with a viscount in the gardens at dusk, harmless, fleeting, and entirely innocent, was twisted by envious tongues into something damning. Compromised, they called her. Reckless. Unworthy. Never mind that there had been no impropriety, no secret tryst. In the court of society, evidence mattered little. Perception was everything. And soon the perception was that Lady Arabella Whitmore was no longer a prize, but a warning. Suitors vanished, invitations dwindled, and those who once praised her now crossed the street to avoid association. Her father, Baron Whitmore, a man of weary pride and failing health, could do little to defend her. With limited fortune and no powerful allies to counter the storm of gossip, his only advice had been resignation. "Hold your head high, Arabella," he had told her with sorrow in his eyes. "The truth will out in time." But time had only deepened the wound. Arabella, however, did not crumble. There were tears, yes, in the privacy of her chamber, but she refused to let the world see her broken. If society wished to exile her, she would walk through their ballrooms with her back straight, her chin lifted, and her dignity intact. She refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her fall. It was this resolve that carried her into Lady Worthington's masquerade ball. The very same evening the Duke of Ravensfield brushed against her hand. Arabella had not gone to seek attention. She had not gone to rekindle the dreams of courtship or marriage. She had gone simply because she would not be cowed. If they would whisper about her, let them whisper while she stood in plain sight. Yet even in her determination, Arabella felt the sting of isolation. As the music soared and couples laughed, she stood at the edge of the room, watching the swirl of gowns and masks. Her only partners were memory and pride. And though she told herself she was content, her heart carried the quiet ache of someone who longed to belong again, to be seen not as a scandal, but as a woman of worth. And then came that moment, that accidental touch, the Duke's sleeve brushing her hand, the spark that leapt between them, and the strange, unshakable weight of his storm-grey gaze. For an instant, Arabella wondered if she had imagined it. Surely it was nothing, just the distraction of candlelight, the fancy of a lonely heart. After all, the Duke of Ravensfield was infamous for his vow, his distance, his disdain for romance. He would not notice her. He would not notice anyone. And yet, when their eyes met, she felt seen. Not as a scandal, not as gossip's victim, not as the discarded rose of last season, but as herself. It rattled her composure, left her breath shorter, her pulse faster. She lowered her gaze quickly, determined to master herself. But the impression lingered. A brush of fate, she thought, though she did not believe in fate. That night, as she returned home to the quiet loneliness of her chamber, Arabella replayed the moment in her mind. The ballroom, the whispering crowd, and the Duke's eyes upon her. It was absurd, foolish, and yet, for the first time in months, the silence of her disgrace felt less heavy. Someone had disturbed the certainty of her exile. And though she could not name it yet, the Duke of Ravensfield had already stepped into the orbit of her story. For days after Lady Worthington's ball, Damien Ravensfield could not banish the memory of Arabella Whitmore from his thoughts. It infuriated him. He was not a man prone to distraction, let alone over something as trivial as a woman's touch. And yet the sensation lingered, as though the ghost of her hand still burned against his sleeve. In the solitude of his study, he paced before the fire, his jaw clenched, his vow whispering like a chain around his heart. He had promised never to feel again, but that promise, once so solid, now cracked beneath the pressure of something he did not understand. The Duke told himself it was curiosity. Nothing more. Arabella Whitmore was disgraced, a pariah. Why had she not fled to the country in shame, as so many ruined women did? Why did she walk into ballrooms with her chin raised, her dignity unbroken? That defiance fascinated him. Against his will, he wanted to see it again. He wanted to test it. And so, the unthinkable happened. A week later, a sealed letter arrived at the modest Whitmore townhouse. Arabella, seated by her father's side as he coughed softly into a handkerchief, broke the seal and nearly dropped it. The raven crest stamped in black wax was unmistakable. The Duke of Ravensfield himself had written to her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The words were brief, written in a precise, commanding hand. "Lady Arabella, I request the honour of your presence at Ravensfield Abbey. The carriage will arrive tomorrow at noon. You may refuse, but you will find it is wiser not to. Damien, Duke of Ravensfield." Arabella stared at the page as though it might vanish if she blinked. An invitation? No, more than that, a summons. The Duke did not ask, he demanded. And what could it mean? A trap? A cruel jest, orchestrated to amuse society at her expense? Her father frowned, his face pale. "Arabella," he said gravely, "this could ruin you further." She knew he was right. To accept would invite gossip darker than any she had already endured. The Duke's interest, even the faintest suggestion of it, would ignite whispers across London. But to refuse, could she dare? The Duke was not a man easily denied, and part of her, the part that still burned with the memory of his eyes, longed to know why he sought her at all. The next day, dressed in her plainest carriage gown of deep green, Arabella found herself seated in the Duke's black coach as it rattled through the countryside toward Ravensfield Abbey. She told herself it was only to defend her dignity, to confront whatever scheme this was. But her heart beat faster with every mile, anticipation and dread mingling until she could hardly breathe. Ravensfield Abbey rose on the horizon like a fortress carved from stone, its grey towers reaching into the autumn sky, its windows gleaming with a cold, austere light. It was beautiful in its severity, much like its master. When the carriage halted at the grand steps, servants in dark livery bowed, their faces carefully blank, as though they had been trained to betray nothing. Inside, the air smelled of polish and smoke, the ceiling soared, and portraits of stern ancestors glared down from the walls. Arabella felt the weight of history pressing against her as she was led into a vast drawing-room where the Duke awaited. He stood by the fire, tall and commanding in a black coat, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply studied her, his storm-grey eyes as cold and cutting as she had imagined. Then, with a faint inclination of his head, he spoke. "Lady Arabella, you came." Arabella drew herself up, her pride a shield. "You summoned me, Your Grace. I thought it best to face whatever purpose you had in mind, rather than let society invent one for you." A flicker of amusement touched his mouth, though it did not soften his eyes. "Bold. Few would dare answer me so plainly." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You intrigue me, Lady Arabella. Do not mistake that for kindness. I wish to see if your strength is as real as society claims, or if you are merely another weak creature broken by gossip." Arabella's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. "Then you will be disappointed, Your Grace, for I am no weak creature." For the first time in years, the Duke felt something stir in his chest, something dangerously close to admiration. And Arabella, though she told herself she despised his arrogance, felt the air crackle between them like a storm waiting to break. The great halls of Ravensfield Abbey echoed with silence. It was not the silence of peace, but of secrets, of a house that had witnessed grief and refused to speak of it. As Arabella was shown to her chamber, a richly appointed room overlooking the frost-kissed gardens, she could not shake the sensation that every portrait, every tapestry, every gilded frame carried the weight of unspoken history. She had expected the Duke to dismiss her after their brief exchange in the drawing-room. Instead, he allowed her to wander the estate under the watchful eye of a taciturn housekeeper. Arabella, restless and curious, explored cautiously. She noticed details others might have missed: dust in a corridor long unused, a locked wing of the abbey sealed with iron bolts, servants who exchanged glances whenever certain subjects arose. It was in the library, vast and shadowed with thousands of leather-bound volumes, that Arabella first stumbled upon a hint of the Duke's past. As she traced her fingers across the spines of history books, one volume slipped loose. Behind it, tucked carelessly on its side, lay a small keepsake album of pressed flowers. Curious, Arabella opened it and found the initials ER inscribed delicately on the first page. Each bloom had been preserved with care: roses, violets, lavender. The sort of sentimental treasure a woman might keep, or a man who wished to remember her. She snapped the book shut at the sound of footsteps. The Duke himself stood at the threshold, his storm-grey eyes narrowing as they fell upon the album in her hands. "You should not pry where you are not invited," he said, his voice low, edged with warning. Arabella lifted her chin, though her cheeks burned. Forgive me, I had not meant—" "You had not meant to uncover what is not yours," he cut in, striding forward to take the album from her grasp. His gloved hand lingered on the cover a moment before he set it firmly back on the shelf. His expression, usually carved from stone, wavered, just for an instant. A shadow passed over his eyes, not anger, but pain. Arabella's heart softened despite herself. "She must have been someone dear," she ventured quietly. The Duke's shoulders stiffened. For a long moment he did not answer. Then, with a bitter laugh devoid of humour, he said, "Dear, yes, once, until she proved herself a liar like the rest." His words cut the air like a blade, final and sharp. But in the depths of his voice, Arabella heard something else. Sorrow, raw and unhealed. The servants had whispered, of course. Even in her exile, Arabella had heard the rumours of Damien Ravensfield's first Duchess, Elena, a beauty who had died tragically young. Some said illness, others a carriage accident. But no one spoke of betrayal. Until now, Arabella dared a step closer, her voice soft but steady. "Is that why you summoned me? To test whether I, too, might betray?" His gaze snapped to hers, fierce and unyielding. "I summoned you because you will not bow, because you stand when others fall. I thought, perhaps, you might remind me that strength exists outside of deceit." The admission startled her more than anger would have. Here was a man society believed untouchable, unfeeling, revealing, with one bitter phrase, the scar that had defined him. And in that moment, Arabella no longer saw the cruel Duke of Rumour. She saw a man wounded, betrayed, and bound by a vow that had become his prison. For the rest of that evening, Arabella's thoughts would not leave him. She replayed the flicker of sorrow in his eyes, the tremor in his voice when he spoke of deceit. Whatever else Damien Ravensfield was, he was not untouched. His fortress was not impenetrable. Later, as she lay in the grand bed of her chamber, listening to the distant howl of winter wind against the abbey's stone walls, Arabella whispered into the darkness a truth she dared not admit aloud. The Duke's vow might not only be his undoing, it might also become her own. Winter's grip had not loosened when the next summons came, this time not to the lonely halls of Ravensfield Abbey, but to the glittering heart of London society. Lady Ashworth's annual winter ball was to be the event of the season, and though Arabella would have preferred to avoid another evening of sharp whispers and hidden laughter at her expense, she received a message she could not ignore. The Duke of Ravensfield intended to escort her there himself. When the black carriage drew up before the modest Whitmore townhouse, the street seemed to still. Curtains twitched, neighbours stared, and Arabella felt the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders as she descended the steps in a gown of sapphire silk. Her father looked on with mingled pride and fear, murmuring, "Hold your head high, Arabella. Tonight they will see you as I have always seen you." Inside the carriage, Damien Ravensfield sat in his customary dark attire, severe mask of composure firmly in place, yet as Arabella settled beside him, he allowed his gaze to travel over her with something unspoken, something that made her pulse quicken. "You need not look so fearful," he said at last. "It is they who should fear you." Arabella forced a smile. "I think, Your Grace, they fear you far more than me." His lips curved faintly, whether in amusement or pride, she could not tell. When they entered Lady Ashworth's ballroom, a hush fell. Chandeliers blazed, violins soared, gowns rustled like a sea of colour, but all eyes turned to the pair at the door. The cold, untouchable Duke of Ravensfield and the disgraced Lady Arabella Whitmore, walking side by side as though no scandal had ever touched them. Whispers spread like wildfire. Fans snapped open, gentlemen leaned to murmur in one another's ears, and Lady Ashworth herself nearly dropped her glass of champagne. "Impossible," someone hissed. "He would never," he vowed. "Why her?" Arabella felt the heat of every gaze sear her skin. She wanted to shrink, to flee. But the Duke's hand, steady and firm against hers, anchored her. He guided her into the centre of the room, as though daring the world to object. "Dance with me," he commanded softly. Her heart stuttered. "Here, now?" His grey eyes glinted. "Unless you mean to prove them right when they say you are ruined." Before she could argue, he swept her into the waltz. The violins rose, and the crowd parted, like water before them. Arabella's gown swirled, the candlelight caught in her hair, and for the first time in months she felt not like an outcast, but like a woman alive again. Yet she could not ignore the murmurs that followed them around the floor, some cruel, some envious, all astonished. Halfway through the dance, the storm broke. Lady Margaret Harcourt, dressed in crimson satin, stepped forward with a smile as sharp as a blade. "How bold of you, Your Grace," she said, loudly enough for half the room to hear. "To champion a woman whose reputation has been so compromised." Gasps rippled. Arabella stiffened, her throat closing. But Damien did not falter. He turned, his voice ringing across the ballroom. "Compromised?" His gaze swept the crowd like a sword. "Only by your slander, Lady Margaret. I will say this once, so there is no mistake. Lady Arabella Whitmore stands at my side by choice. And any who question her worth question mine as well." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, deliberately, he lifted Arabella's hand to his lips and pressed a kiss upon her glove, a gesture so intimate, so final, that it shattered every whisper at once. Arabella's breath caught. Around them, faces flushed with shock, envy, outrage. Lady Margaret's smile faltered into fury. But the Duke's expression remained cool, his eyes burning only for Arabella. When the dance ended, he guided her firmly from the floor. "Now," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear, "they will think twice before daring to sneer." Arabella's heart thundered. She had come expecting humiliation. Instead, she had found herself claimed, not cruelly, not as a pawn, but as though her worth had been carved into stone by the Duke's own hand. And yet, as the night wore on, she could not help but wonder, had he defended her for her sake, or for his own pride? The night after Lady Ashworth's ball was a blur of disbelief for Arabella. She had endured scorn, prepared for mockery, yet instead had walked beneath the chandeliers on the arm of the most untouchable man in England. The Duke's defence had silenced every sneer. His kiss upon her glove still burned like fire in her memory. And yet that fire carried questions she could not extinguish. 2 days later, Ravensfield's carriage came again, summoning her to the Abbey. This time she entered not with trepidation, but with a fierce determination to demand answers. She would not be used as some pawn in a game of pride. The Duke awaited her in the drawing-room, as severe as ever in black. He studied her with that same unsettling calm, as though weighing her soul. "You are angry," he said at once. Arabella drew a steady breath. "Of course I am. You paraded me before London as though I were some trophy to silence gossip. Did you think I would not see it?" His mouth twitched, but whether from irritation or reluctant respect, she could not tell. "You misunderstand. I did not parade you. I shielded you." "Shielded me?" Her voice sharpened. "Or shielded yourself from whispers that the great Duke of Ravensfield takes interest in a woman society calls ruined?" For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. Then, with sudden force, Damien crossed the room, stopping so close she could feel the heat of him. His storm-grey eyes bored into hers. "Do you truly think I care for their whispers?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Let them choke on them. I would burn every ballroom in London to ash if it meant silencing their venom, but you—" He paused, his gaze flickering, betraying the barest crack in his armour. "You did not bow when they sought to break you, that I will not allow them to punish." Arabella's breath caught. His words rang with sincerity, but still she pressed, unwilling to surrender. "And what of you, your grace? You swore never to love again. You guard your heart as if it were stone. Why summon me? Why defend me, if not to prove you still hold the power to claim?" The question struck its mark. His jaw tightened, his hands flexed at his sides. For an instant, she thought he would lash out with anger. Instead, he turned sharply, striding to the window where the winter light spilled across his shoulders. "Because you unsettle me," he admitted, his voice harsh with unwilling truth. "Because one touch, your touch, has undone years of silence. I vowed I would never again feel, and yet when I look at you I feel too much." The confession hung in the air, stark and trembling. Arabella stared, her heart racing. She had expected arrogance, manipulation, but not this. Not honesty. Slowly she approached, every step an act of courage. "Then why fight it? Why hide behind vows that only chain you to grief?" He turned at last, and in his eyes she saw the storm she had only guessed at before, pain, fury, longing, all colliding. "Because love is betrayal," he whispered. "It destroyed me once. It will not do so again." For a long moment, neither moved. The air between them crackled, alive with the nearness of something neither dared name. Then, unable to stop herself, Arabella lifted her hand, the same hand that had brushed his sleeve that night at the masquerade. Gently, she laid it against his cheek. He froze, as though struck. His breath shuddered, his eyes closing as though her touch seared him. For the first time, Damien Ravensfield did not look like the cruel, unyielding Duke. He looked like a man, haunted, fragile, desperate for something he could not name. When he opened his eyes again, they burned. "Careful, Arabella," he murmured, voice low and ragged. "One day I may not let you take your hand away." Her heart thundered, but she did not move. She met his gaze with quiet defiance. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, you should not." The silence that followed was not cold, but charged. A silence that promised the fragile beginning of something far more dangerous than society's whispers. Winter melted reluctantly into spring, but for Arabella Whitmore, peace never lasted long. For weeks after the ball, whispers had dulled, replaced by cautious curiosity. The Duke of Ravensfield's protection made her untouchable, at least to those who feared his wrath. But London society was never content with silence. Rumours were embers waiting only for a careless breath to ignite them again. That careless breath came from Lady Helena Carroway. Helena had been Arabella's tormentor since the first whispers of scandal had destroyed her name. A woman of beauty but venomous tongue, she thrived on ruin, especially when it belonged to others. And Helena, humiliated by Damien's public defence of Arabella, returned with a vengeance. It began with sly remarks over tea tables. One wonders what she offered the Duke to win his attention. Then came insinuations whispered in church pews, claims of secret trysts, even a cruel suggestion that Arabella had ensnared Ravensfield through blackmail. The gossips grew bold once more, emboldened by Helena's malice. Arabella bore it with dignity, but inside her heart trembled. She feared the Duke would tire of defending her, that his vow would reassert itself, and she would once again be cast adrift in a sea of ridicule. That fear sharpened when Helena struck openly at Lord Whitmore's modest townhouse. Arabella and her father had hosted a small gathering of allies when Helena arrived uninvited, sweeping into the parlour in a gown of emerald silk and a smile dripping poison. My, Helena said, her voice carrying across the stunned room. How charming that Lady Arabella still dares to play hostess. One almost forgets the circumstances of her disgrace, or perhaps we are to thank His Grace of Ravensfield for lending her borrowed dignity. The words hit their mark. The guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Arabella and her father. Lord Whitmore's face flushed with shame and fury, but before Arabella could respond, the air shifted. Damien Ravensfield himself stood in the doorway. He had come unannounced, cloaked in black, his presence filling the small townhouse like a storm. His gaze locked on Helena, and for the first time her confidence faltered. "You will leave," he said, his voice a blade. Helena's laugh was brittle. "Leave? Surely you don't mean to silence me, Your Grace. The truth will be spoken whether you will it or not." Damien advanced, each step deliberate. "You mistake venom for truth. Lady Arabella's honour is not yours to tarnish. It is mine to protect, and protect it I shall." He turned to the room, his voice carrying like thunder. "Let every person here bear witness. Lady Arabella Whitmore is under my guardianship. Any insult to her is an insult to me, and I do not forgive insults." Gasps broke across the parlour. Helena paled, her mask slipping, but she forced a final sneer. "So it is true then. The great Duke lowers himself at last, all for her." Arabella's heart stopped. Every eye turned to Damien, waiting, hungry for scandal. In that instant he could have denied her, could have shielded his pride with silence. Instead, he did the unthinkable. "Yes," he said, voice clear and fierce, "for her." The words fell like stones into still water, rippling outward. For a moment the room was frozen, stunned. Then Helena, her face twisted in defeat, swept from the house without another word. Arabella could scarcely breathe. Relief, awe, and a dawning terror coursed through her. The Duke had not only defended her, he had claimed her, publicly, irrevocably. Later, when the guests had gone and only the two of them remained, Arabella turned to him, her voice trembling. "Why did you say it? Why speak so plainly when you vowed never to love again?" Damien's eyes, storm-grey and unyielding, softened at last. He reached for her hand, his touch deliberate, reverent. "Because lies have ruled my life long enough," he said quietly. "And you, Arabella, you are the only truth I have left." Her breath caught, tears rising unbidden. For the first time the Duke's vows seemed less like chains and more like something breaking, something yielding to a future neither of them had dared hope for. The days after Helena's defeat passed in a haze of tension and longing. London now buzzed with whispers of the Duke's open claim, and though many were too afraid to mock Arabella, curiosity swelled like a tide. Invitations flooded in, some hopeful of aligning with Ravensfield's power, others hungry to see if the scandal would unravel. But for Arabella the greater storm lay not in society's curiosity, but in Damien himself. He had spoken words no one expected, for her, words that haunted her with both promise and peril. Yet since that night he had retreated into silence once more, as though baring his soul had left him raw, and now he armoured himself again. At Ravensfield Abbey, Arabella confronted him. The great drawing-room stretched vast around them, shadows flickering across carved oak panels. He stood by the fire, staring into its blaze as though seeking answers in the flames. "You cannot say such things and then vanish into silence," she said, her voice steady though her heart pounded. His jaw tightened. "I said what was necessary." "Necessary?" Her voice sharpened. You spoke as though I meant something to you, as though your vow no longer ruled you. Was that mere theatre, to silence Helena? He turned then, and the storm in his eyes struck her like a blow. Theatre? Do you think I parade my heart for amusement? You know nothing of what it cost me to speak those words. Arabella lifted her chin. Then tell me. If they cost you so much, why speak them at all? The silence stretched, heavy and taut. At last, Damien's control fractured. He strode forward, every step taut with restrained fury, until he stood before her close enough that the heat of the fire seemed to wrap them both. Because, he said, his voice breaking, I swore never again to love, never again to bleed for another's betrayal, and yet... He broke off, fists clenching, breath ragged. And yet every time I look at you, I feel that vow splintering. Do you understand what that means? To stand on the edge of the same abyss that nearly destroyed me? Arabella's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. This was not the untouchable Duke society feared. This was a man haunted, terrified of his own heart. Slowly, she reached for his hand, prying open his clenched fist until her fingers wove with his. It means, she said softly, that you are still alive, that you are not stone nor ash, no matter how much you wish to be. He flinched but did not pull away. His gaze searched hers, desperate, as though looking for the betrayal he expected. And if you too betray me, if you prove no different? Arabella's throat tightened, but she did not look away. Then at least you will have lived, Damien. At least you will have loved again. Better that than to rot behind walls of your own making. Her words struck something deep. His breath shuddered, and for the first time, he seemed not like the master of his fate, but a man standing naked before truth. With a sudden, almost violent motion, he pulled her closer, his forehead pressing against hers. You undo me, Arabella, he whispered, his voice rough. Every touch, every word, you unravel what I swore would never break. Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled through them. Then let it break, and build something new with me. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then Damien's lips found hers, fierce and desperate, as though years of restraint had finally crumbled. The kiss seared through her, not the cold claim of a cruel duke, but the wild surrender of a man who had finally, irrevocably, chosen to feel. When at last they parted, both breathless, Damien cupped her face with trembling hands. If I fall, he whispered, I fall to you. Arabella laid her hand over his. Then fall, Damien, I will not let you shatter. Spring unfurled into summer, and with it came the height of the season, the Duchess of Ashworth's midsummer ball. It was the grandest event in London, a gathering of dukes, earls, ladies and fortune-seekers, all beneath ceilings dripping with chandeliers and walls echoing with gossip. For weeks tongues had wagged about Damien Ravensfield and Lady Arabella Whitmore. Were they a scandal, an affair, a fleeting amusement? Or was the unthinkable true? Had the Duke, who vowed never to love again, finally fallen? Arabella dreaded the night. She knew every eye would be upon them. Yet when Damien's carriage came, he did not merely escort her. He took her hand, steady and sure, and held it as if it belonged there. The ballroom glittered with gold and silk, but as they entered, silence rippled outward like a wave. Whispers hissed. There they are. It cannot last. He will never wed her. Lady Helena Caraway, never one to be defeated for long, pounced. Dressed in a gown of blood-red satin, she swept to the centre of the floor, her voice pitched to carry. How curious, she declared. that his grace parades his charity once more. Tell us, Duke, how long before you tire of protecting the ruined Lady Whitmore, or shall we all wait for the inevitable day she breaks you, as love has done before?" The cruelty struck sharp. Gasps echoed, fans snapped shut, and all eyes turned to Damien. Arabella's heart clenched. She braced herself, ready to endure humiliation again. But Damien did not remain still. He strode forward, every inch the Duke, yet with something new in his bearing, a fierce, unshakable resolve. He took Arabella's hand and drew her into the centre of the room, beside him. The crowd pressed in, hungry for scandal. "You speak of ruin, Lady Helena," he said, his voice carrying like thunder. "But the only ruin here is the rod of your own envy." Gasps rang out, but he did not pause. He turned then, not to Helena, not to the watching crowd, but to Arabella herself. And in the hush that followed, Damien Ravensfield, the untouchable Duke who had sworn never to love again, did the unimaginable. Before all of London he sank to one knee. The room erupted in cries of shock. Fans fluttered wildly, men craned to see, women clutched pearls. But Arabella could see only him, the storm-grey eyes no longer guarded, the proud man humbled not by defeat, but by choice. "Arabella Whitmore," Damien said, voice rough yet unyielding, "I vowed I would never again love, never again risk my heart. But you, your courage, your fire, your touch, have broken that vow. Gladly broken it. You have given me back what grief stole, and so I kneel before you not as the Duke society fears, but as the man who would spend every day proving that you are my salvation. Will you be my wife, my duchess, my heart's keeper?" Arabella's breath shuddered, tears welled, blurring the blaze of chandeliers above. For a moment she stood frozen, every cruel whisper of the past echoing through her mind. Ruined, unworthy, forgotten. And then with trembling grace she dropped to her knees before him, refusing the gulf of rank and pride. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking yet sure. "Yes, Damien, I will." The ballroom erupted. Some gasped in outrage, others in awe, but none could deny what they saw, the cruel Duke undone, not by scandal, but by love. He rose, drawing her into his arms, and when his lips met hers, the gossip of London dissolved into nothing but thunderous applause. That night, the vow that had bound him shattered completely. No longer the Duke of Silence and Stone, Damien Ravensfield became the man who had chosen love, freely, irrevocably. And Arabella, once cast aside, stood radiant at his side, not as a pawn, not as a scandal, but as the woman who had brought the cruel Duke to his knees. The days following Damien's public surrender at the Duchess of Ashworth's ball were nothing short of seismic. London awoke to a new reality. The cruel Duke, the untouchable Lord of Ravensfield, had not only broken his vow, but had knelt before a woman once scorned as ruined. It was a story too tantalizing for society to resist. Newspapers hinted at it with sly lines, caricatures of the scene appeared in penny prints, and the drawing rooms of Mayfair buzzed endlessly. Yet amidst the storm of gossip, something unexpected happened. Arabella Whitmore, once pitied or mocked, now commanded a strange kind of respect. Invitations arrived daily at Ravensfield House, some sincere, many dripping with curiosity, but all carried a new tone. She was no longer dismissed, no longer invisible. She was the woman who had tamed the Duke. For Arabella it was overwhelming. The same faces that had sneered now greeted her with honeyed smiles, but she carried herself with dignity, never forgetting the sting of their former cruelty. She did not seek vengeance, her quiet grace was vengeance enough. When Lady Helena Caraway attempted once more to spread venom, she found herself isolated. No one wished to challenge the woman the Duke of Ravensfield openly adored. Helena, red-faced and seething, withdrew from London for health reasons, and her absence was noticed by none. Meanwhile, Damien found himself a man transformed. For years he had lived walled within his vow, his heart encased in ice. Now, with the vow shattered, warmth seeped into every corner of his life. He no longer prowled society with grim disdain. Instead, he stood proudly beside Arabella, offering her his arm at every gathering, his gaze openly softening whenever it fell upon her. The image was so startling that people whispered, "The Duke smiles now. He truly smiles." Their betrothal was announced formally in the Times, sealed with a notice of their wedding date. Congratulations poured in from allies and rivals alike, though some, no doubt, did so grudgingly. Damien cared little. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened, no longer chained to ghosts of betrayal. Arabella had given him more than companionship. She had given him freedom. At Ravensfield Abbey, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. The vast estate, once shrouded in austerity, seemed to breathe easier. Servants whispered of the Duchess-to-be with genuine fondness, for Arabella greeted them with kindness, remembering names, listening to their stories. Even the stern housekeeper admitted she had never seen His Grace so content. The echoing halls, once so cold, began to fill with music and laughter as Arabella oversaw the refurbishing of neglected rooms, determined to make the Abbey not merely a fortress, but a home. But not everything was smooth. Some lords muttered that Damien had shown weakness by kneeling, that power should never bow to love. One evening at his club, a baron remarked that the Duke's heart had softened into foolishness. Damien's reply was swift and sharp. "If love is foolishness, then I am glad to be a fool." The remark, repeated across town, silenced many and inspired admiration in others. For Arabella, the greatest change was internal. She no longer felt like the disgraced girl, haunted by whispers. Each morning she woke to letters, to flowers sent by well-wishers, to the knowledge that she was no longer merely surviving scandal. She was rewriting her place in history. Yet what mattered most to her was not the shifting gaze of society, but the simple truth of Damien's devotion. He no longer hid behind walls. He sought her counsel, shared his fears, and held her hand not only in ballrooms, but in quiet gardens where no one watched. One evening, as the sunset gilded the abbey in hues of gold, Damien led her to the chapel. There, upon the altar, he placed a small velvet box in her hands. Inside lay a ring, an emerald encircled with diamonds, radiant and fierce. "This belonged to my mother," he said softly. "I swore I would never give it to another, for I thought no one could be worthy. But you, Arabella, you are not only worthy. You are the reason my heart beats anew. Wear it, and let the world see that I am yours as surely as you are mine." Tears blurred her vision as she slipped the ring onto her finger. In that moment, with the light pouring through stained glass and Damien's hand clasping hers, Arabella knew the truth. They had not merely survived scandal, they had turned it into triumph. Their wedding day loomed, not as an obligation, but as the promise of a future built not on fear, but on love. And though society might still whisper, one thing was clear. The Duke, who had vowed never to love again, had surrendered completely, and the woman he chose stood radiant, unbreakable, and adored. The bells of St. George's rang bright across London on the morning of their wedding. Crowds gathered outside, not out of scorn but of awe. For months, the tale of the cruel Duke's surrender had captivated every ear, and now the city thrummed with anticipation. Arabella Whitmore, once shunned, now walked toward destiny, not as a disgraced woman, but as a bride whose courage had transformed the unyielding heart of a duke. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the aisle in jewel tones. Arabella, draped in ivory silk and lace, moved with quiet grace, her emerald engagement ring gleaming like a beacon of triumph. Murmurs rippled as she passed, admiration, respect, even envy. But none of it touched her, for her eyes were fixed on Damien. He stood at the altar, every inch the Duke, commanding, elegant, yet softened in a way only she could see. When their gazes met, the entire room seemed to fade, leaving only two hearts tethered across the aisle. The vows, when spoken, were more than ritual. Damien's voice, steady yet thick with emotion, carried a weight far beyond tradition. "I once swore I would never again love," he said, each word resonant. "But today, before God and all of London, I vow to love you until my final breath." Gasps filled the church, followed by silence so profound that Arabella's soft reply seemed to echo like music. "And I vow to never let you forget that love is stronger than fear." When the ceremony ended and their lips met as husband and wife, applause thundered, drowning out every whisper of the past. Outside, the bells tolled with joy, and the streets erupted in celebration. The Duke and Duchess of Ravensfield emerged hand in hand, no longer chained by scandal, but lifted by triumph. Life at Ravensfield Abbey flourished in the months that followed. What had once been a fortress of silence grew vibrant with laughter, music, and warmth. Arabella transformed the library into a sanctuary not only for herself and Damien, but for village children, opening its doors for learning. The people, once wary of their aloof duke, now spoke of his kindness, for he too had changed. Damien spent afternoons walking the grounds with her, speaking not of politics and power, but of dreams, of family, of hope. Their love was not without challenge. There were days when old shadows stirred, when Damien's memories of betrayal threatened to harden him once more. But each time, Arabella's touch, her steady presence, reminded him of the vow he had remade, the vow to love. And each time he returned to her, softer, stronger, freer. Seasons turned. One autumn evening, as leaves blazed gold across the abbey grounds, Arabella stood with Damien on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The wind tangled her hair, the horizon stretched wide, and for the first time in years, Damien spoke, not of vows broken, but of futures built. "You saved me," he murmured, wrapping her in his arms. "The world may call me a duke, but you call me a man, and I would kneel 1,000 times if it meant keeping your heart." Tears stung her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the beauty of a truth fully realized. She had not only found love, she had become the reason a broken man learned to love again. In the quiet of that moment beneath the endless sky, their story, once woven of scandal and sorrow, stood rewritten as one of redemption and devotion. Arabella, the Duchess who rose from ruin, and Damien, the Duke who surrendered pride for love, walked forward together into a life no vow could ever shatter. For in the end, it was not society, nor whispers, nor wealth that defined them. It was love, unyielding, unbreakable, and eternal.